Martha Collins had been living with secrets for 12 years. At 63, she appeared exactly as her volunteer badge suggested, a retired librarian who occasionally helped at the local Veterans Center, teaching literature classes and organizing book donations. Her cardigan sweaters and sensible shoes painted the picture of a gentle grandmother who enjoyed baking cookies and knitting scarves for her grandchildren. But identity cards can tell convenient lies when the truth would raise too many questions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. For nearly 2 decades, Martha had been something that existed only in classified files, with the highest security clearances. She had been one of the military's most accomplished long-range precision marksmen, what civilians would call a sniper. Her call sign had been Whisper, earned through her legendary ability to eliminate high-value targets without anyone ever knowing she was there. She'd executed missions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and multiple classified locations that remained redacted even in her own service record. As one of the first women to qualify for the most elite shooting units, Martha had broken barriers while maintaining an accuracy record that remained unmatched even years after her retirement. Her expertise wasn't just in pulling a trigger. It came from an almost supernatural ability to calculate wind speed, humidity effects, and atmospheric distortion in seconds. She could account for the Earth's rotation when shooting distances that most marksmen couldn't even see clearly through their scopes. Where others saw impossible shots, Martha saw mathematical equations to be solved with breath control and trigger discipline. After a classified operation that left her with a permanent limp in her right leg, Martha had retired quietly. No ceremonies, no public acknowledgments, no recognition of service that officially never happened. The transition to civilian life had been harder than any mission she'd completed. Combat operations had clear objectives and defined endpoints. Civilian life was messier, with social expectations that felt more complex than coordinating an elimination from over 2 miles away. But she'd found her way to work that gave her purpose without requiring the burden of life or death decisions. Teaching literature at the Veterans Center let her connect with former service members who understood the weight of carrying classified experiences. Helping veterans find meaning in books provided a different kind of service than what she'd performed in uniform. She'd settled in a mid-sized town in Colorado, close enough to the mountains to indulge her love of hiking despite her limp, far enough from military installations that questions about her past rarely arose. She'd established routines that made her part of the community without drawing attention to her background. Most people saw exactly what she wanted them to see: a kind-hearted retired librarian who baked excellent pies and never missed the local high school shooting team competitions. Her only visible connection to her previous life was a certain steadiness that came from someone who'd been in situations where staying calm kept people alive. The kind of quiet confidence that suggested she'd handled pressure before, though she never mentioned what kind of pressure or where. But invisible connections ran deeper than what people could observe. The calculation skills that had been honed through thousands of impossible shots taken in conditions most shooters would consider impossible. The muscle memory developed through years of training that had become so ingrained it was now simply part of who she was. The knowledge of weapon systems that went far beyond what any civilian hobbyist could claim. Martha carried those skills like scars, invisible to casual observers but permanent reminders of who she'd been when being that person had mattered more than anything else in the world. Most days she never thought about them, focusing instead on her book club selections and her volunteer schedule at the local elementary school's reading program. But some skills, once learned, never fade. Some identities, once earned, follow you forever. And sometimes, when the situation requires it, old abilities can still serve new purposes. The morning she drove toward Fort Garrison, Martha had no idea that her carefully constructed civilian life was about to collide with the military world she'd left behind. She was simply going to deliver some donated books for the base library, something she'd been doing quarterly for nearly 3 years without incident or complication. But today would be different. Today she would discover that some skills never truly disappear, and some expertise never truly fades, no matter how many years have passed since it was last called upon. The checkpoint at Fort Garrison had been operating under enhanced security protocols for the past month. Intelligence reports suggested potential terrorist threats to military installations throughout the western states, and base commanders had received orders to increase scrutiny of all personnel entering federal facilities. Additional screening procedures, enhanced verification protocols, zero tolerance for unauthorized access attempts. Corporal David Mitchell had been assigned to the main gate for 3 weeks, part of the security enhancement that brought fresh personnel to positions where experience might have created complacency. At 24, he was eager to demonstrate his vigilance and professional competence to supervisors who were evaluating his performance. A recent graduate from military police training, determined to prove himself worthy of the trust placed in him. The morning briefing had emphasized the importance of strict adherence to security protocols. "We're not just checking IDs," Sergeant Wilson had explained to the checkpoint team. "We're looking for patterns that don't match expectations. Anyone who seems out of place, anyone whose documentation doesn't align with standard procedures, anyone who can't provide immediate verification of their authorization status." Mitchell had taken notes, understanding that his career progression depended on his ability to identify and handle security situations appropriately. No one wanted to be the guard who let someone through who shouldn't have gained access. Better to be overly cautious than to make a mistake that could compromise base security. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When Martha's sedan approached the checkpoint, Mitchell immediately noticed that she didn't fit the typical visitor profile. Most people delivering to the base library came in official vehicles from recognized organizations. This gray-haired woman in a cardigan drove a personal car and presented credentials that seemed somehow insufficient. "Ma'am, I'm not seeing your name on today's access roster," Mitchell announced after consulting his computer terminal with exaggerated thoroughness. He'd been trained to project authority through professional confidence, to make it clear that security procedures were non-negotiable. Martha handed over her volunteer identification and donation authorization. "Check under, quote, community outreach program," she suggested. Sometimes the book donations are processed separately from general visitor access. Mitchell studied her credentials with a kind of suspicious attention that suggested he was looking for reasons to deny access rather than facilitate legitimate business. The documentation seemed legitimate, but lacked the detailed specificity he'd been taught to expect from authorized personnel. "These volunteer credentials don't provide sufficient detail about the specific materials you're authorized to deliver," he announced with growing confidence. "I'm going to need additional verification before I can allow entry." Martha remained calm, understanding that young guards often interpreted security protocols more strictly than necessary. "Corporal, I've been delivering books here quarterly for 3 years. The base library is expecting this donation for their veterans reading program." But Mitchell had made his decision. Recent briefings had emphasized the importance of denying access to anyone whose credentials didn't meet enhanced security standards. Better to inconvenience a legitimate visitor than to allow unauthorized access that could compromise base security. "Ma'am, I need you to pull your vehicle to the secondary inspection area," he ordered, loud enough for nearby personnel to witness his professional diligence. Martha complied without argument, understanding that resistance would only escalate a situation that could be resolved more efficiently through cooperation. She moved her sedan to the designated area with the unhurried movements of someone who'd been through similar situations before. "What's the matter, Grandma? Lose your bingo group?" Mitchell asked with a smirk that suggested he thought he was being entertaining rather than professional. His colleagues laughed with the kind of confidence that came from people who thought they'd identified a security problem and were handling it appropriately. Private Reynolds and Private Garcia flanked Mitchell, their hands resting on their equipment belts in a display of readiness that was more theatrical than necessary. They'd been trained to work as a team during security situations, to present a united front that discouraged resistance or attempts to circumvent proper procedures. "Please step out of the vehicle, ma'am," Mitchell ordered. "We need to inspect these boxes before we can determine if they're authorized for delivery." Martha stepped out slowly, favoring her right leg with the limp that had become part of her identity after retirement. She watched calmly as the young guards began examining the boxes of books in her trunk with exaggerated thoroughness, as though paperback novels might somehow contain hidden threats to national security. "War and Peace, huh?" Mitchell said, pulling a volume from one of the boxes. "Planning to bore our soldiers to death?" His colleagues laughed again, emboldened by their superior's attitude toward the older woman. "Actually, it's quite popular with the officers," Martha replied mildly. The strategic elements of Napoleon's campaign offer interesting parallels to modern military operations. Mitchell's expression shifted slightly. perhaps recognizing that the old lady knew more about military interests than he'd expected. But he'd committed to his course of action and wouldn't back down now, not with his colleagues watching. "Ma'am, these boxes will need to be fully inspected by the canine unit before we can allow them on base," he announced. "That's going to take at least 2 hours. You can wait in the visitor center or come back tomorrow." Martha calculated the delay against her other commitments for the day. The Veterans Center was expecting her to lead an afternoon discussion group, and postponing the book delivery would disrupt the base library's schedule for cataloging new materials. "Corporal, perhaps you could contact Lieutenant Ferguson in the Community Relations Office," she suggested. "She can verify that these materials are expected today." Mitchell's expression hardened at what he perceived as an attempt to circumvent his authority. "Ma'am, all visitors are subject to the same security protocols regardless of who they might know on base. You'll need to follow standard procedures just like everyone else." The condescension in his tone was unmistakable, the kind of dismissive attitude, often directed toward older women presumed to be using their age to seek special treatment. His colleagues exchanged glances that suggested they viewed Martha as nothing more than an inconvenience in their day, an old lady who didn't understand modern security requirements. As Martha stood beside her car, leaning slightly on her cane to relieve pressure on her right leg, the base loudspeaker system suddenly crackled to life with an announcement that changed everything. "Attention all personnel, this is not a drill. Security alert condition Delta is now in effect. All non-essential personnel report to designated shelter locations. Security teams to alert positions. Repeat, this is not a drill." The atmosphere at the checkpoint transformed instantly. The guards' postures shifted from casual confidence to focused alertness, hands moving to their sidearms as training took over. Mitchell's radio buzzed with rapid communications, security codes, and position assignments, flowing in an urgent stream of information. "All access points locked down," a voice announced over the radio. "Potential hostile approach from the west perimeter. Unidentified individuals with long-range weapons observed on the ridgeline, approximately 4,000 meters from the command center." Martha's attention sharpened at those words, her mind automatically calculating distance, angle, and potential firing positions based on the base layout she remembered from previous visits. 4,000 meters was an extreme distance, beyond the effective range of most marksmen, but not impossible for someone with the right equipment and skills. "Ma'am, you need to leave immediately," Mitchell ordered, his earlier condescension replaced by urgent professionalism. "The base is under security alert. All civilian visitors must exit through the main gate." Martha didn't move. Instead, she was scanning the western horizon, her eyes focusing on the distant ridgeline mentioned in the radio call. Years of training had taught her to identify potential sniper positions instinctively, to recognize the subtle characteristics that made certain locations ideal for long-range shooting. "Corporal, do you have counter-sniper personnel on base?" she asked, her voice carrying a calm authority that hadn't been present in their earlier conversation. Mitchell blinked in surprise at both the question and the change in her demeanor. "Ma'am, you need to leave now. This is a security situation." "Answer the question, Corporal," Martha said, still scanning the ridgeline. "Counter-sniper units. Do you have them deployed?" "That's classified information, ma'am," Mitchell replied automatically, though his uncertainty was evident. The security alert was developing rapidly, and the checkpoint team was focused on lockdown procedures rather than civilian management. Martha made a decision based on decades of experience evaluating tactical situations. Sometimes the mission required revealing capabilities that had been carefully hidden. Sometimes protecting lives mattered more than protecting secrets. "Corporal," she said quietly, "in the trunk of my car, beneath the false floor under the spare tire, there's a case. I need you to retrieve it now." Mitchell stared at her, confusion evident in his expression. "Ma'am, I don't have time for—" "The people on that ridgeline are setting up for a shot at your command center," Martha interrupted. "Based on wind conditions and the angle of approach, they'll have a firing solution in less than 10 minutes. Your standard security teams won't have the equipment to engage at that distance." Something in her tone, the absolute certainty, the precise tactical assessment, gave Mitchell pause. Against his better judgment, he moved to the trunk of her car, still open from their earlier inspection of the book boxes. "Lift the carpet in the trunk. Release the 2 latches on either side of the spare tire mount," Martha instructed calmly. "The case is in a recessed compartment." Mitchell followed her instructions, finding and releasing the hidden latches. The compartment opened to reveal a long, narrow aluminum case with no markings or identification. He looked up at Martha, newfound wariness in his expression. "Open it," she directed. Inside the case, nestled in custom-cut foam, lay a disassembled precision rifle that even Mitchell, with his limited armory experience, recognized as a highly specialized weapon system. Each component gleamed with the kind of immaculate maintenance that spoke of deep respect for the equipment. "What the hell?" he whispered, looking from the weapon to the unassuming older woman standing beside him. "Chetak M200 intervention," Martha said matter-of-factly. "Modified barrel, custom trigger assembly, specialized optics. Effective at ranges beyond what your standard military rifles can manage." Mitchell's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, uncertainty written across his features. "Ma'am, I need you to step back from the vehicle." Martha met his gaze with the steady calm of someone who had faced far more threatening situations. "Corporal, in approximately 8 minutes, someone on that ridgeline is going to take a shot at your command center. I can stop them, but only if you let me help. Now, you can waste time trying to figure out who I am, or you can make a decision that might save lives today." The radio crackled again, with increased urgency. "Confirmed hostile elements on West Ridgeline. Sniper team visible through long-range optics. Distance prevents effective engagement with standard equipment. All personnel clear the command center immediately." Mitchell hesitated, caught between training that demanded strict adherence to security protocols and the immediate threat unfolding around him. Martha recognized his dilemma and offered the only thing that might break through his uncertainty. "Whisper 7, she said quietly. "Authorization code, November Echo Sierra Tango 47. Verify with Colonel Lawrence Davidson, Special Operations Command." The effect wasn't as immediate as she'd hoped, but she saw recognition flicker in Mitchell's eyes. The authorization code format wasn't something civilians would know, and the reference to Special Operations Command carried weight that couldn't be easily dismissed. "Get the base commander on the radio," Martha continued. "Tell him you have a former USSOCOM precision specialist offering assistance with the current situation." As Mitchell relayed the information through his radio, Martha began assembling her rifle with the practiced efficiency of someone who could perform the task blindfolded. Each component locked into place with precision, her fingers moving through sequences embedded in muscle memory through thousands of repetitions. Private Reynolds watched with undisguised astonishment as the grandmotherly woman transformed before his eyes, her movements suddenly precise and economical. Nothing wasted, nothing unnecessary. The assembled rifle looked like something from a specialized military catalog, far beyond civilian hunting equipment. "How do we know we can trust her?" Reynolds whispered to Mitchell as they waited for a response from command. Mitchell didn't have an answer, but the radio provided one for him. "Security Checkpoint Alpha. This is Colonel Bennett. I'm told you have someone claiming special operations background. Authentication code." Mitchell looked to Martha, who nodded calmly. "Whisper 7. Authorization, November Echo Sierra Tango 47, he repeated into the radio. A long pause followed, tension building with each passing second. When the radio finally crackled back to life, the colonel's voice carried a tone of stunned recognition. "Holy! Checkpoint Alpha, escort that individual to the Southwest Observation Tower immediately. Priority clearance. I repeat, priority clearance." Mitchell stared at Martha, seeing her in an entirely new light. "Ma'am, Save it for later," Martha interrupted, securing the last components of her rifle system. "We have approximately 6 minutes before they have a firing solution on your command center. The Southwest Tower gives me the elevation I need for a counter position." As Mitchell hurried Martha toward a waiting security vehicle, the transformation in his demeanor was complete. Gone was the condescending smirk and casual dismissal of an older woman. In its place was the kind of respectful efficiency reserved for recognized authority figures. "Reynolds, secure her vehicle," Mitchell ordered. "Garcia, radio ahead to the tower and make sure it's cleared for immediate access." Martha settled into the security vehicle with her rifle case, mind already shifting into the operational focus that had defined her military career. Distance calculations, wind estimation, humidity factors. All the variables that would affect an extreme range shot were already being processed in her mind, preparing for what would likely be the most important shot she'd taken in over a decade. The security vehicle sped through Fort Garrison, with emergency lights flashing but sirens silent, maintaining operational security while moving with urgent purpose. Martha sat calmly in the passenger seat, her rifle case balanced across her knees, mind already settling into the focused state that had once been as natural as breathing. Mitchell drove with tense concentration, stealing occasional glances at the unassuming older woman who had suddenly become central to the base's defensive response. ETA 3 minutes to Southwest Tower, he reported into his radio, receiving immediate confirmation from the tower security team that the area was being cleared for their arrival. Martha used these moments to center herself, controlling her breathing and clearing her mind of distractions. The familiar pre-mission calm settled over her, not the absence of fear, but its transformation into heightened awareness and precision. Her hands, which had appeared slightly tremulous when handling her volunteer ID card earlier, were now perfectly steady. "Ma'am," Mitchell began, uncertainty evident in his voice despite his attempt at professionalism. "I should inform you that the individuals on the ridgeline are approximately 4,200 meters from the command center. That's beyond standard engagement range for military counter-sniper teams using conventional equipment," Martha finished for him. "Not for me." The confidence in her voice wasn't bravado. It was the simple statement of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of doing. Mitchell fell silent, focusing on navigating the base's internal roads toward the Southwest Tower, a 6-story observation structure that provided the best vantage point for the western approach to the base. As they pulled up to the tower's base, a security team was already in position, creating a perimeter that would allow Martha immediate access. A tall man in a colonel's uniform waited at the entrance, his expression a mixture of urgency and disbelief. "Colonel Bennett," Martha acknowledged as she stepped from the vehicle, rifle case in hand. The colonel's eyes widened slightly in recognition. "It really is you. When they radioed your authentication code, I thought someone was playing a sick joke." "No joke, Colonel. Just fortunate timing." Martha moved toward the tower entrance without waiting for further conversation. Time was critical, and pleasantries could wait until after the threat was neutralized. The elevator ride to the top floor of the observation tower took 47 seconds. Martha counted them automatically, part of the mission timing calculations that had once been essential to coordinated operations. Colonel Bennett and Corporal Mitchell accompanied her, both maintaining a respectful silence that acknowledged the gravity of the situation. When the doors opened, Martha moved directly to the western-facing observation platform. The tower had been cleared of all personnel except essential security, creating an operational space that minimized distractions. A spotter with high-powered binoculars was already focused on the distant ridgeline. 3 individuals visible, the spotter reported immediately. 2 in support positions, 1 primary. They're setting up what appears to be a large-caliber rifle system. Distance calculated at 4,187 meters from command center. Martha nodded, already opening her rifle case and completing the final assembly of her weapon system. Her movements were precise and economical, the kind of efficiency that comes only from thousands of hours of practice. The rifle took shape in her hands like an extension of her own body, each component settling into place with perfect fit. "What's the wind condition?" she asked, not looking up from her work. "Variable 6 to 9 knots, west to northwest," the spotter replied. "Humidity at 42%, barometric pressure 30, 12 and steady." Martha processed these variables automatically, making mental calculations that would affect bullet trajectory over extreme distance. The scope she attached to her rifle wasn't standard military issue, but a specialized optic system, designed for shots that most marksmen would consider impossible. Colonel Bennett watched with growing amazement as the seemingly fragile older woman transformed before his eyes into something entirely different, a weapons specialist whose expertise was evident in every movement. When she loaded a single round into the chamber, he finally broke his silence. "Mrs. Collins," Martha supplied, settling the rifle against her shoulder and beginning her preliminary aiming sequence. "Martha Collins." Mrs. Collins, I should inform you that even our best counter-sniper teams consider 4,000 meters to be beyond reliable engagement range. The variables at that distance are significant but manageable, Martha interrupted calmly. I've made shots at greater distances under worse conditions. She adjusted her position slightly, finding the optimal stability point for her stance. Your team should be prepared to provide additional security if my first shot doesn't eliminate all 3 targets. The colonel exchanged glances with Mitchell, both men coming to terms with the reality that this grandmotherly figure was discussing eliminating human targets with the calm detachment of a seasoned combat specialist. Perhaps you should let me do a final spotting calculation, the base spotter suggested, clearly uncomfortable with relying on a civilian senior citizen for such a critical shot. Martha didn't respond verbally. Instead, she began speaking in a quiet, methodical voice as she looked through her scope. Target elevation, 7,346 feet. Firing position, 6,452 feet. Uphill shot with approximately 894 feet elevation differential. Air density calculation for altitude. She continued the complex ballistic calculations aloud, factoring in variables that the base spotter hadn't even mentioned. The Coriolis effect from Earth's rotation, the slight temperature gradient between their position and the target, the minimal atmospheric light refraction from the midday sun position. The spotter fell silent, recognizing expertise that exceeded his own training. Colonel Bennett moved to the observation window, raising his own binoculars to verify the distant threat personally. They've completed their setup, he reported tensely. Primary shooter is in firing position. We have approximately 2 minutes before they have a solution on the command center. Martha completed her calculations and made final minute adjustments to her scope. Her breathing slowed to the controlled rhythm that had once been as natural as her heartbeat, creating the perfect momentary stillness needed for extreme precision. I have the solution, she said quietly, her voice carrying the absolute certainty that had once made her the military's premier long-distance shooter. On my mark, I'll eliminate the primary threat. Your security teams should be prepared to respond if the support personnel attempt to retrieve the equipment or establish a secondary position. Colonel Bennett nodded, relaying these instructions through his radio to the quick reaction force already staged for deployment. Mitchell stood transfixed, watching as the woman he'd mocked less than 30 minutes earlier prepared to make a shot that the base's most qualified snipers would consider nearly impossible. Martha settled into her final firing position, the rifle becoming a perfect extension of her body. Her mind cleared of all distractions, focusing entirely on the minute adjustments needed to account for wind, distance, and the barely perceptible movement of her target nearly 3 miles away. "Sending it," she murmured, the old operational phrase coming back automatically after years of disuse. The rifle's report echoed through the observation tower, despite its sound suppression system. Martha remained perfectly still, maintaining her position as she observed the results through her scope. 4.5 seconds passed, the time required for the bullet to travel the extreme distance to its target. Primary threat neutralized, she announced calmly, already adjusting her aim slightly, shifting to secondary position. Before Colonel Bennett could respond, Martha had chambered another round and fired again. Then, a third shot followed with the same methodical precision. The entire sequence took less than 30 seconds from first shot to last. All 3 targets neutralized, she reported, finally relaxing her position slightly. Confirm with your observation team. The base spotter was already scanning the distant ridgeline with his high-powered optics. Confirmed, he said, his voice carrying undisguised astonishment. All 3 targets down. No movement visible. Colonel Bennett stared at Martha with newfound respect that bordered on awe. Mrs. Collins, that was the most extraordinary shooting I've ever witnessed. 3 consecutive hits at over 4,000 meters, in variable wind conditions, with minimal preparation time. Martha began disassembling her rifle with the same methodical care she'd used in assembly, her movements unhurried despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. The second and third shots were easier once I confirmed the wind calculation with the first impact. Her matter-of-fact tone made the extraordinary achievement sound routine, as though making 3 consecutive shots at a distance where the curvature of the Earth became a ballistic factor was something anyone might accomplish on a good day. Mitchell, who had watched the entire sequence with stunned silence, finally found his voice. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology for my conduct at the checkpoint. I made assumptions based on what you saw," Martha finished for him, securing the last components of her rifle in its case. "That's what I wanted you to see, Corporal. The best disguise is often the one people create in their own minds." Colonel Bennett's radio crackled with updates from the Quick Reaction Force, now moving toward the ridgeline to secure the area and retrieve the would-be attackers' equipment. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the security implications remained significant. "Mrs. Collins, I'd appreciate it if you'd join me for a debriefing," Bennett said, his tone making it clear this wasn't really a request. "We need to understand how these individuals selected our base as a target, and whether this represents a broader threat pattern." Martha nodded, recognizing the necessity of the security protocols even as she calculated how this incident would affect her carefully constructed civilian identity. The quiet retirement she'd built over the past 12 years had just been compromised in the most public way possible. As they descended in the elevator, Martha noticed Mitchell studying her with the kind of intense curiosity that suggested he was trying to reconcile two completely different images of the same person, the unassuming elderly volunteer and the precision shooter who had just made shots that would be considered legendary in military circles. "Something on your mind, Corporal?" she asked mildly. Mitchell hesitated, then asked the question foremost in his thoughts. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, how does someone with your skills end up delivering books to a base library?" Martha considered the question, appreciating its directness. When you've spent your life making sure certain people don't see another sunrise, there comes a point when you want to bring something different into the world. Books open minds. They build bridges instead of burning them. The elevator doors open to reveal a base in controlled chaos. Security teams moving with purpose. Alert status announcements echoing over loudspeakers. Personnel in protective postures securing critical infrastructure. The transformation from routine day to active threat response was complete. Colonel Bennett led Martha toward the command center, where senior officers were already gathering for an emergency briefing on the attack and response. As they walked, Bennett kept his voice low, meant for Martha's ears alone. Whisper 7. "I knew I recognized that call sign. You were part of the operation in Kazakhstan, weren't you?" 2006. The Separatist leadership elimination. Martha neither confirmed nor denied, maintaining the operational security that had been drilled into her through decades of classified missions. "Colonel, I retired from active service 12 years ago. The specifics of my operational history remain classified at levels I suspect exceed your current clearance." Bennett nodded, accepting the non-answer as confirmation of his suspicion. "What I don't understand is why someone with your background is spending retirement delivering books to base libraries." "Because libraries need books, Colonel," Martha replied simply. "And retirement doesn't erase who you are or what you're capable of doing when necessary." They entered the command center, where a group of officers fell silent at Martha's approach. News of her extraordinary shooting had clearly preceded her arrival, creating an atmosphere of cautious respect, tinged with disbelief. "Gentlemen," Colonel Bennett addressed the group, "this is Mrs. Martha Collins, who neutralized the sniper threat on our western perimeter. Mrs. Collins has a specialized background that uniquely qualified her to respond to today's situation." The commanding officer, a brigadier general whose nameplate identified him as General Howard, studied Martha with undisguised curiosity. "Mrs. Collins, on behalf of everyone at Fort Garrison, thank you for your intervention today. Our counter-sniper teams were still mobilizing when you neutralized the threat." Martha acknowledged the thanks with a simple nod, uncomfortable with recognition that had never been part of her operational parameters. For most of her career, success had meant completing missions that would never be acknowledged, eliminating threats that officially never existed. "I'd like to understand how you happened to be on base with a precision rifle system during an attack," General Howard continued, his tone carefully balanced between gratitude and suspicion. "The rifle stays secured in my vehicle," Martha explained, force of habit from my previous career. "As for being on base, I was delivering donated books to your library when the alert was announced." The general exchanged glances with Colonel Bennett, clearly receiving silent confirmation of this unlikely story. "And you just happen to have the skills necessary to engage targets at over 4,000 meters. "Not happen, General," Martha corrected gently. "Developed over 20 years of specialized service. Skills like that don't disappear just because you've retired from using them regularly. A junior officer entered the command center with a tablet displaying preliminary information from the Quick Reaction Force. "Sir, we've secured the ridgeline position. 3 hostiles confirmed neutralized. They had a modified Barrett M82A1 with custom optics, likely capable of engaging targets at our command center. Electronic devices recovered from the site are being analyzed for intelligence value." General Howard absorbed this information with a grim nod before turning back to Martha. "Mrs. Collins, given your unique contribution today, I'd like to request your assistance with our investigation. Your expertise might help us understand the tactical approach these individuals were attempting." Martha recognized the careful phrasing, a polite request that carried the weight of national security implications. Her carefully constructed civilian identity had already been compromised. Participating in the investigation wouldn't further expose her background. "I'll help however I can, General," she agreed. "Though I should mention that I was expected at the Veterans Center this afternoon for a book discussion group." The incongruity of this statement, mentioning a book club after neutralizing a sniper team that had threatened a military installation, created a moment of stunned silence before General Howard responded. "I'm sure we can arrange for someone to cover your community commitments, Mrs. Collins. Your insights here are irreplaceable." For the next 3 hours, Martha participated in a detailed debriefing, analyzing the recovered equipment, reviewing the tactical approach the attackers had employed, and offering assessments based on her expertise. The experience was strangely familiar. The structured environment of a military operations center, the focused questions from intelligence specialists, the careful documentation of tactical details. What was unfamiliar was conducting such activities while being openly acknowledged. Throughout her career, Martha had operated in shadows, her contributions known only to those with the highest security clearances. Now she sat in a briefing room surrounded by officers who openly recognized and respected her expertise. Corporal Mitchell had been assigned as her escort, a designation that carried unspoken acknowledgement of how profoundly the base security team had misjudged her initial appearance. The young guard who had mocked her hours earlier now hovered nearby with an attentiveness that bordered on reverence. As the debriefing concluded, General Howard addressed Martha directly. "Mrs. Collins, I've been in contact with USSOCOM headquarters. They've confirmed your former status and authorized me to extend their gratitude for your intervention today. The intelligence we've gathered suggests this was a sophisticated attack plan targeting a high-value meeting scheduled in our command center this afternoon." Martha absorbed this information with the same calm she'd demonstrated throughout the day. "General, I'm glad I could be of assistance. Now, if you don't mind, I should retrieve my vehicle and those books." The base library was expecting that delivery. Her matter-of-fact return to her original purpose created another moment of cognitive dissonance for the officers present. This woman had just prevented what could have been a devastating attack on a secure military facility, yet she remained concerned about delivering donated books for a reading program. "Of course," General Howard agreed, signaling to Mitchell. "Corporal, please ensure Mrs. Collins has everything she needs to complete her original mission on base." As Martha rose to leave, Colonel Bennett asked the question that had likely been on everyone's mind. "Mrs. Collins, if you don't mind, how did someone with your background end up spending retirement delivering books to military bases?" Martha considered the question, aware that her answer would likely become part of the base's institutional memory. "Colonel, I spent 20 years ensuring that certain people never got to finish their stories. Now I help make sure that others have new stories to begin. Both missions matter in their own way." The simple eloquence of her response left the room in thoughtful silence as she departed with Mitchell. As they walked toward the security vehicle that would return them to the main checkpoint, the young corporal struggled to find appropriate conversation. "Ma'am, I want to apologize again for how I treated you at the gate," he finally managed. "I made assumptions based on how you looked, and I was completely wrong." Martha studied the young man, recognizing genuine remorse beneath his professional demeanor. "Corporal, do you know why I was effective as a specialized shooter for so long?" Mitchell shook his head, eager for insight from someone whose skills had just demonstrated mastery beyond anything in his experience. "Because no one ever expected someone like me to be a threat," Martha explained. "I didn't look like what people imagine when they think of military specialists." That perception gap was an operational advantage. Today it nearly became a disadvantage when you delayed my access to base. Mitchell absorbed this lesson with the seriousness it deserved. I'll remember that, ma'am. Appearances can be misleading in both directions. Exactly, Martha confirmed. The most dangerous person in any room rarely looks like the most dangerous person in the room. That's why they're effective. As they reached the security vehicle, Martha noticed that word of her actions was already spreading throughout the base. Personnel they passed watched her with undisguised curiosity, some nodding in respect, others whispering to colleagues as she passed. The anonymous retirement she'd carefully maintained for 12 years had been irrevocably altered in a single afternoon. The implications of this exposure would need to be addressed, but for now, Martha remained focused on completing what she had come to do. The books still needed to be delivered, and maintaining routine provided stability amidst the disruption of unexpected events, another lesson learned through years of operational experience. To the library first, she directed Mitchell as they settled into the vehicle. Those books won't deliver themselves. The base library at Fort Garrison occupied a modest, single-story building near the eastern perimeter, its understated exterior giving little indication of the vital role it played in maintaining morale and continuing education for military personnel. When Martha and Corporal Mitchell arrived with the boxes of donated books, they found the library staff already aware of the security situation but completely unaware of Martha's role in resolving it. "Mrs. Collins, we were worried you might have been caught up in the security alert," called out Eleanor Winters, the head librarian, as she hurried toward them. "We've been under shelter-in-place orders for the past 2 hours." Martha smiled warmly at the younger woman who had been her primary contact for book donations over the past 3 years. "Just a slight delay at the checkpoint, Eleanor. Nothing serious." Mitchell nearly choked at this spectacular understatement but maintained his professional composure as he helped unload the boxes from the security vehicle. The way Martha effortlessly shifted back into her role as a kindly book donor fascinated him. The transformation was so complete that if he hadn't witnessed her previous actions, he would never suspect she was anything other than a retired librarian with a passion for literature. "These are mostly fiction this time," Martha explained as Eleanor began examining the donations. "Though I included some military history and strategy texts that the officers' reading group requested last month." Eleanor nodded appreciatively. "The strategy books have been incredibly popular. Colonel Bennett mentioned that the last Sun Tzu translation you brought sparked quite a debate at their monthly discussion." "Sun Tzu tends to do that," Martha replied with a knowing smile. "His principles remain relevant despite the centuries that have passed since he first articulated them." As they sorted through the donations, Martha maintained the friendly, somewhat meandering conversation style that Eleanor expected from her, discussing upcoming book club selections and community reading initiatives. Not once did she allude to the fact that less than an hour earlier, she had neutralized 3 armed threats from an impossible distance. Mitchell watched this performance with growing amazement, recognizing that he was witnessing a level of compartmentalization that few people could achieve. The woman discussing the merits of different translations of Russian literature seemed entirely separate from the precision shooter who had made calculations accounting for the Earth's rotation before pulling a trigger. When Eleanor stepped away to answer a phone call, Mitchell seized the opportunity to satisfy his curiosity. "Ma'am, how do you do that?" "Do what, Corporal?" Martha asked, though her slight smile suggested she understood his question perfectly. "Switch between who you are now and who you were up in that tower," he clarified, keeping his voice low. "It's like watching 2 completely different people." Martha considered his question as she carefully arranged a set of poetry collections on a return cart. "They're not different people, Corporal, just different applications of the same discipline. Whether you're stabilizing your breathing for a 4,000-meter shot or maintaining a cover identity, the principle is the same: complete focus on the task at hand." Before Mitchell could pursue this insight further, the library door opened to admit Colonel Bennett, whose presence immediately drew attention from everyone in the room. The colonel nodded politely to Eleanor before approaching Martha directly. "Mrs. Collins, I hope I'm not interrupting, but General Howard would like a word before you leave the base." His tone made it clear this wasn't a casual request. "Some developments in our investigation have raised additional questions he believes you might help clarify." Martha recognized the carefully phrased statement for what it was. New intelligence had emerged that connected to her former operational background. Of course, Colonel. I've just finished here. She turned to Eleanor with an apologetic smile. Duty calls, it seems. Would you mind if we postponed our discussion of next month's veterans reading selections? Not at all, Eleanor assured her, clearly curious about why a base colonel would personally retrieve Martha but professional enough not to ask directly. We can catch up by phone later this week. As Martha and Mitchell followed Colonel Bennett back to the security vehicle, the colonel briefed them on the situation with the kind of precise efficiency that military leadership reserved for critical information. Analysis of the equipment recovered from the ridgeline has identified specialized modifications consistent with a particular mercenary group. The electronic devices contained communications that suggest today's attempt was part of a larger coordinated operation. Martha absorbed this information without visible reaction, though her mind was already processing the implications. Have you identified the specific group? Bennett hesitated briefly before responding. The signatures match the Veracity Collective. Does that mean anything to you? For the first time since the entire incident began, Martha's composure showed a slight crack, a momentary widening of her eyes, a barely perceptible tensing of her shoulders. The reaction lasted less than a second, but both Bennett and Mitchell noticed it. Yes, Colonel. That means a great deal to me. Bennett nodded as though her response confirmed something important. General Howard suspected as much. That's why he's requested your specific insights. The return to the command center carried a different energy than their previous visit. This was no longer about debriefing after a successfully resolved threat. Something larger was unfolding. Something connected to Martha's classified past in ways that clearly concerned the highest levels of base leadership. When they arrived, General Howard was waiting with two individuals Martha didn't recognize. A woman in a dark suit that screamed federal agency, and an older man in civilian clothes whose bearing suggested military background, despite his lack of uniform. Mrs. Collins, General Howard greeted her, his tone more formal than before. Thank you for returning. We've received intelligence that puts today's incident in a more concerning context. Let me introduce Special Agent Melissa Rodriguez from the FBI's Counterterrorism Division and Mr. James Blackwood from CERMI, a specialized government consultation service. Martha recognized the deliberate vagueness of Blackwood's introduction. Government consultation services were often thin covers for intelligence operations that maintained official deniability. The man studied her with the calculating assessment of someone verifying a long-held suspicion. Mrs. Collins, Blackwood acknowledged with a slight nod. Or perhaps I should say, Whisper 7, your reputation precedes you, even a decade after your official retirement. Martha returned his gaze steadily. Mr. Blackwood, I'd say your reputation precedes you as well, but I suspect that would defeat the purpose of your carefully maintained low profile. A ghost of a smile touched the man's face, the professional recognition between two people who had operated in similar shadows. Indeed. Which makes this conversation both unusual and necessary, given the circumstances. General Howard gestured toward the briefing room. Shall we continue this discussion in a more secure environment? The small group moved into a conference room equipped with advanced security features, signal blocking technology, surveillance countermeasures, and restricted access protocols that suggested this space was reserved for highly classified discussions. Once seated, Agent Rodriguez opened a laptop and turned it toward Martha. Mrs. Collins, we've identified the 3 individuals you neutralized on the ridgeline. All were former military with specialized training, now working as contractors for the Veracity Collective, a private military company with connections to several hostile foreign intelligence services. The screen displayed personnel files for the 3 men, their military backgrounds, and subsequent activities after leaving service. Martha studied the information without comment, though her mind was making connections with precision born from years of intelligence analysis. What Agent Rodriguez isn't saying, Blackwood interjected, is that these men were part of an operational team, specifically tasked with targeting former Special Operations personnel. Personnel like yourself. Martha looked up from the screen, her expression carefully neutral. You're suggesting I was the target, not the base. We believe the attack on Fort Garrison was secondary, General Howard confirmed. Intelligence recovered from their equipment indicates they were aware of your regular visits to deliver books. Today's operation appears to have been designed to eliminate you specifically, with the command center as a secondary target if the primary mission failed. Martha absorbed this information with the calm assessment of someone who had dealt with personal threats throughout her operational career. The Veracity Collective has reason to hold grudges against certain former operators. My involvement in Kazakhstan in 2006 directly impacted their founder's family. Blackwood nodded, unsurprised by her knowledge. Viktor Korshinov lost his brother in that operation. He spent considerable resources identifying everyone involved. Despite the classified nature of the mission, we believe he's located at least 3 other members of your former team. And their status? Martha asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Agent Rodriguez's expression tightened. 2 confirmed deceased in what appeared to be accidents. 1 missing for the past 8 months. Presumed eliminated. The implication settled heavily in the room. Martha was facing a targeted vendetta from a well-resourced adversary with specific knowledge of her background and current activities. Her carefully constructed civilian identity hadn't been as secure as she'd believed. We've maintained surveillance on known Veracity Collective associates entering the country, Rodriguez continued. 3 additional operational teams have been identified in the past month, all with profiles and equipment suggesting they're prepared for specialized elimination missions. General Howard leaned forward, his expression grave. Mrs. Collins, given the threat assessment, we're prepared to offer protective custody until this situation can be resolved through appropriate channels. The offer was professionally delivered, but revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of who Martha was. Protective custody, being secured in a safe location, movements restricted, dependent on others for security, would be anathema to someone who had spent decades relying on her own skills and judgment. I appreciate the offer, General, but that won't be necessary, Martha replied with calm certainty. I've managed similar situations throughout my career. With respect, Mrs. Collins, Rodriguez countered, you were actively serving with full operational support during those situations. Retirement has changed your resources and backup options. Martha smiled slightly. Agent Rodriguez, retirement changed my daily activities, not my capabilities or connections. The Veracity Collective isn't the first organization to target me personally, and they've already demonstrated they're not particularly skilled at succeeding. Blackwood studied her with newfound respect, recognizing the confidence of someone who had survived decades in a profession where mistakes meant death. She's right, General. Protective custody would likely create more vulnerabilities than it would resolve. Static defensive positions against specialized hunters rarely end well. General Howard clearly wasn't comfortable with this assessment but recognized he lacked the authority to force the issue. At minimum, we need to establish secure communications and emergency protocols. If additional Veracity teams are operating in the region, you should have direct channels to appropriate response resources. This was a reasonable compromise that Martha could accept. Agreed, though I should mention that my current residence already has certain modifications that weren't included in the building permits. The hint of a smile touched Blackwood's face again. I would expect nothing less. The question remains whether you intend to maintain a defensive posture or take more proactive measures regarding this threat. The question carried significant implications. Proactive measures was delicate phrasing for eliminating the threat at its source, an approach that would require reactivating operational capabilities and connections that Martha had deliberately set aside 12 years earlier. My preference would be for official channels to address the Veracity Collective through appropriate legal and intelligence frameworks, Martha replied carefully. That said, I have no intention of waiting passively if those channels prove insufficient. Agent Rodriguez frowned slightly at the implications but didn't challenge the statement directly. Instead, she turned to practical considerations. We should establish a secure communication protocol immediately. If you observe surveillance or encounter suspicious activities, having immediate support options will be critical. As they discussed logistics, Martha considered how dramatically her life had changed in the span of a single day. The quiet retirement she'd carefully constructed, book deliveries, veterans reading groups, community volunteering, had been irrevocably altered by a single incident that reconnected her to the shadowed world she'd left behind. Yet there was something almost inevitable about this development, as though her former life had been patiently waiting for the right moment to reclaim her. The skills that had defined her military career hadn't diminished through disuse. They had merely been redirected toward different purposes. When the meeting concluded, Martha found herself once again escorted by Corporal Mitchell as they headed toward the main checkpoint where her car remained parked. The young guard had witnessed the entire extraordinary sequence of events, from his initial dismissive treatment of an elderly visitor to the high-level security briefing that revealed her true background. "Ma'am," Mitchell ventured as they walked, "I know this isn't my place to ask, but what happens now?" Martha appreciated his directness. "Now, Corporal, I go home, water my plants, and finish preparing for tomorrow's Veterans Reading Group. Life continues, just with a few additional security considerations." Mitchell looked genuinely perplexed by this response. "But there are people actively trying to, after what we just learned in there." "Trying to kill me," Martha finished matter-of-factly. "Yes, that's apparently the case. It's not the first time, though the retirement context does add an interesting new dimension to the situation." Her calm acceptance of this reality seemed to unsettle Mitchell more than the threat itself. "How can you be so casual about something like that?" Martha stopped walking and turned to face the young guard directly. "Corporal, when you've lived as long as I have in the kinds of environments I've worked in, you develop a particular perspective on threat and risk. Fear is natural, but letting it control your actions is a choice, one I decided long ago not to make." "Is that how you made those shots today?" Mitchell asked. "By not being afraid of failing?" "Partly," Martha acknowledged. "But it's more about understanding that fear serves no useful purpose in the moment of action. It's valuable as preparation. It keeps you vigilant, makes you check your equipment twice, forces you to consider contingencies. But when the moment comes to act, fear becomes nothing but interference in the communication between your mind and body." Mitchell considered this wisdom with the respect it deserved. "I think I understand. Like how elite athletes talk about being in the zone during competition." "Exactly like that," Martha confirmed. Though with somewhat higher stakes than losing a game, they continued toward the checkpoint where Martha's sedan waited under guard. The security team that had mocked her hours earlier now stood at respectful attention, word of her actions having spread throughout the base with the efficiency of military communications networks. As Mitchell helped transfer the empty boxes from the security vehicle back to her car, he struggled with a final question that clearly weighed on his mind. "Ma'am, can I ask you something personal?" Martha nodded, already anticipating the nature of his curiosity. "If you could go back and choose a different path, one that didn't involve the kinds of operations that led to people wanting revenge against you today, would you?" It was a profound question from someone so young, revealing a depth of reflection that suggested Mitchell might have more potential than his earlier behavior had indicated. Martha considered her answer carefully, wanting to provide something of genuine value rather than a comfortable platitude. "Corporal, the path I chose involved making hard decisions in situations where there were no good options, only less terrible ones. Those decisions saved lives that will never know they were in danger. They prevented conflicts that will never appear in history books. And yes, they created enemies who still seek retribution years later." She paused, looking across the base that had been protected by her actions today. "But if I had chosen differently, I wouldn't have been here today with the specific skills needed for that specific moment. The 3 people on that ridgeline would have succeeded in their mission, and others would have paid the price for my different choice." Mitchell nodded slowly, absorbing this perspective. "So you don't regret the cost of the path you chose?" "I acknowledge the cost," Martha corrected gently. "Regret implies I would choose differently given the same circumstances." "I wouldn't. Every path has consequences, Corporal. The question isn't whether you can avoid them, but whether you can accept them with clear eyes and continue forward." As Martha prepared to leave Fort Garrison, Colonel Bennett approached for a final word. Unlike earlier, his demeanor now carried the professional respect reserved for recognized peers rather than civilian visitors. "Mrs. Collins, General Howard asked me to personally convey his appreciation for your assistance today. We've arranged for discreet security monitoring of the routes between your residence and regular destinations, including this base and the Veterans Center." Martha nodded in acknowledgement. "Thank you, Colonel. Though I should mention that I rarely follow predictable routes, even for routine activities. Old habits from former occupations tend to persist." Bennett smiled slightly. "I suspected as much. Nevertheless, the resources are available should you need them. The special authentication code you used earlier has been flagged in our security system. If you use it at any checkpoint or in any communication with base personnel, It will trigger immediate priority response. This was significant. The military was essentially providing her with an emergency response protocol, typically reserved for active high-level operators. I appreciate that, Colonel. Let's hope it proves unnecessary. As Martha drove away from Fort Garrison, she maintained her habitual security procedures, varying her route, watching for vehicles that maintained consistent positions, identifying potential choke points where an ambush might be staged. These weren't conscious decisions, but ingrained patterns developed through decades of operational experience. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the landscape as she considered how dramatically her circumstances had changed. The quiet retirement she'd built over 12 years had been exposed as more fragile than she'd realized. The past had found her, despite her careful efforts to create distance from it. Yet, there was something almost liberating in this new reality. The need for constant pretense, hiding her capabilities, subduing her instincts, maintaining a facade of ordinary civilian limitations, had been partially lifted. Her true identity had emerged when circumstances demanded it, and the skills she'd spent a lifetime perfecting had once again served their purpose. As Martha approached her modest home in the quiet Colorado neighborhood, she was already calculating adjustments to her security protocols, identifying potential surveillance positions, and planning contingency responses for various threat scenarios. The transition from retired librarian to vigilant operator happened seamlessly, like a dancer returning to a familiar routine after years away from the stage. Her neighbors would notice nothing different about the kindly older woman who grew prize-winning roses and hosted the local book club. They would see only what they expected to see: a pleasant retiree going about her ordinary routines. They would remain unaware that behind her friendly smile lay the calculating precision of someone who had spent decades ensuring that threats were eliminated before they could materialize. Martha parked in her garage, closing the door before exiting her vehicle, a basic security measure that had been part of her daily routine since retirement. Inside her house, she moved directly to the hidden panel beside her refrigerator, entering a code that activated her security system's enhanced monitoring mode. Only then, with perimeter sensors active and surveillance countermeasures in place, did she allow herself to fully process the day's events and their implications for her future. The Veracity Collective would not abandon their vendetta simply because their first attempt had failed. If anything, today's incident would intensify their determination. Martha Collins, former Whisper 7 precision specialist with 20 years of classified operations, poured herself a cup of tea and settled into her favorite reading chair. On the table beside her sat a dog-eared copy of War and Peace that she'd been working through for her veterans reading group. The irony wasn't lost on her, discussing Tolstoy's meditations on conflict and peace while preparing for a very personal war that had found its way to her doorstep. But perhaps that was fitting. After all, the best literature reflected life's fundamental truths, including the one she had lived by throughout her career. Peace was not merely the absence of conflict, but the willingness to face it when necessary. As darkness fell outside her windows, Martha opened her book and began reading where she had left off, her mind simultaneously engaged with Tolstoy's prose and the layered security preparations she would implement in the coming days. The woman who had made a 4,000-meter shot to save a military base was now focused on words written by a Russian count nearly 2 centuries earlier. Some might find the contrast jarring. Martha found it perfectly natural. After all, both activities required the same fundamental quality: absolute presence in the moment, whether that moment involved calculating a ballistic trajectory or appreciating the nuances of classic literature. The Veterans Center occupied a converted Victorian house near the center of town, its wraparound porch adorned with American flags and welcoming rocking chairs that invited conversation. 3 days after the incident at Fort Garrison, Martha arrived for her regular literature discussion group, carrying freshly baked cookies and well-worn copies of the books they'd be discussing. To casual observers, nothing about her appearance or demeanor suggested anything had changed. She wore the same cardigan sweater and comfortable shoes, greeted the center's staff with the same warm smile, and settled into her usual chair in the reading room with the practiced ease of someone following a cherished routine. What remained invisible were the careful security protocols she'd implemented before leaving her home. The varied route she'd taken to the center, the discreet security devices concealed in her unassuming tote bag, the mental map of every exit and potential defensive position within the building. Precautions that had once been professional requirements were now personal necessities. "Martha, we were starting to worry you might not make it today," called Robert Jenkins, a Vietnam veteran who had been part of her reading group since its inception 3 years earlier. His weathered face broke into a genuine smile as she entered the room. "And miss our discussion of Tolstoy?" "Not a chance, Robert," Martha replied, setting out her materials on the central table. "Besides, I promised cookies, and I've never broken a promise to this group yet." The room gradually filled with irregular participants, 8 veterans ranging in age from 26 to 82, representing service across 5 decades of American military operations. What bound them together wasn't just their shared experience of military service, but their discovery that literature offered a language for processing experiences that often defied conventional expression. Martha had founded the group after noticing how many veterans visited the local library seeking books that might help them understand their own experiences through the lens of others' stories. What had begun as casual conversations about favorite authors had evolved into structured discussions that provided both intellectual stimulation and emotional support. "Before we dive into Tolstoy, I'd like to welcome a new member to our group," Martha announced, gesturing toward a young man sitting somewhat awkwardly near the door. "This is Corporal David Mitchell from Fort Garrison. He expressed interest in our discussions, and I assured him all service members are welcome here." Mitchell nodded self-consciously as the group welcomed him with the easy camaraderie that veterans extend to those who share their foundational experiences. What Martha didn't mention was that Mitchell's presence wasn't entirely coincidental. He had contacted her the previous day, his call routed through the secure communication channel established by Colonel Bennett. "Mrs. Collins," he had explained, "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding literature and perspective. I was wondering if your veterans book group might be open to new participants." Martha had recognized the request for what it was, partly genuine interest, partly a discreet security measure arranged by Fort Garrison Command. Mitchell would serve as an unobtrusive protective presence while simultaneously benefiting from the group's discussions. An elegant solution that honored both her independence and the legitimate security concerns raised by the Veracity collective threat. As the discussion began, Martha guided the conversation with a skilled facilitation that had made her group so successful. "Tolstoy challenges us to consider how individuals maintain their humanity in the face of events beyond their control," she suggested. "How does Prince Andrei's perspective evolve throughout the story, and what parallels might we find in our own experiences?" The ensuing conversation moved fluidly between literary analysis and personal reflection, with veterans drawing connections between Tolstoy's examination of the Napoleonic Wars and their own encounters with conflict across different eras and theaters of operation. Mitchell initially remained quiet, but gradually began contributing thoughtful observations that revealed genuine engagement with the text. "What strikes me," offered Sarah Delgado, a former Army medic who had served in Afghanistan, "is how Tolstoy shows that courage isn't about fearlessness. It's about maintaining your principles even when everything around you is chaotic." That resonated with my experience in field hospitals. Martha nodded encouragingly. "Excellent observation, Sarah." Tolstoy understood that true courage is revealed not in grand heroic moments, but in the accumulated choices we make under pressure over time. As the discussion deepened, Martha noticed a subtle change in Mitchell's posture and expression. The professional vigilance with which he'd entered the room, eyes continuously scanning for threats, position selected for optimal visibility of entrances, gradually softened as he became genuinely absorbed in the conversation. This transformation represented exactly what Martha had designed the group to facilitate, the temporary setting aside of hypervigilance in favor of intellectual and emotional engagement. For veterans whose military training had permanently altered how they perceived potential threats, these moments of authentic presence in non-tactical contexts were precious and healing. When the scheduled 2 hours concluded, several participants lingered, continuing conversations sparked by the formal discussion. Martha noticed Mitchell engaged in animated conversation with James Chen, a Marine Corps veteran who had found solace in Russian literature after his 3rd deployment. Tolstoy understood something essential about how combat changes your perception of time, Chen was explaining. The way he stretches certain moments in battle while compressing others mirrors exactly how I experienced firefights. Mitchell nodded with the recognition of shared truth. I never had words for that until today. The way seconds feel like hours when you're under fire, but then entire operations seem to compress into blurs in your memory afterward. Martha busied herself cleaning up, allowing these organic connections to develop without her facilitation. The true value of the group often emerged in these unstructured conversations after the formal discussion concluded, veterans finding their experiences validated and illuminated through both literature and shared recognition. As the center gradually emptied, Martha found herself alone with Mitchell, who helped stack chairs with the automatic efficiency of someone accustomed to maintaining orderly spaces. "Thank you for allowing me to join today," he said, his tone suggesting the gratitude extended beyond mere politeness. "I've never experienced anything quite like that discussion." Martha smiled, recognizing the subtle shift in his perspective. "Literature gives us frameworks for understanding experiences that might otherwise remain locked in isolation. That's why these discussions matter. They build bridges between private experiences and shared human understanding." Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "I noticed something about the group members. They all carry themselves differently when they're engaged in the discussion, like they temporarily set aside a weight they're used to carrying." "Very perceptive, Corporal," Martha acknowledged. "Hypervigilance is exhausting. Even when it's become so habitual, you barely notice it anymore. These discussions provide safe spaces to redirect that constant scanning of the environment towards something enriching rather than depleting." As they walked toward the parking area, Mitchell casually positioned himself between Martha and the street, a protective positioning technique taught in security details. His vigilance had returned now that they had left the structured environment of the discussion group. "I should mention," he said quietly, "we've identified surveillance on 2 of your regular locations. Nothing active yet, just observation. Colonel Bennett asked me to inform you directly rather than through official channels." Martha nodded, unsurprised by this development. "Pattern establishment," she noted. "Standard preliminary to an operation. They're identifying routines before planning specific action." The calm with which she analyzed her own targeting was striking. No fear, just professional assessment of tactical realities. Mitchell marveled at her composure, recognizing that it stemmed not from naivete but from decades of operational experience. "The security team wanted to intervene," he continued, "but Colonel Bennett suggested we should consult you first. He said something about not disrupting established counter-surveillance measures you might have implemented." Martha appreciated Bennett's professional courtesy. Many security officials would have intervened immediately, potentially compromising her own more subtle security protocols in the process. "The Colonel is correct," she confirmed. "Premature disruption of surveillance often creates more problems than it solves. Better to let them believe their observation is undetected while gathering information about their methods and personnel." They reached Martha's car, where she paused before opening the door. "Thank you for the information, Corporal, and for your contribution to today's discussion. Your perspective on Bolkonsky's battlefield epiphany was quite insightful." Mitchell seemed momentarily surprised that she would shift from tactical considerations to literary analysis so seamlessly, before realizing that this integration of seemingly disparate elements was fundamental to who Martha was: a precision shooter who loved Tolstoy, a tactical specialist who found meaning in poetry, a lethal operator who baked cookies for veterans. "Will you be at next week's discussion?" Martha asked, her tone suggesting this was entirely his choice rather than a security obligation. Mitchell nodded with genuine enthusiasm. "I've already started reading the Hemingway you recommended. I'd like to understand why you think his sparse style speaks so directly to combat experience." "Excellent," Martha replied. "I look forward to your insights." As she drove away, Martha maintained her security protocols, varying her route, watching for vehicles that might be following, identifying potential choke points or ambush locations. But her mind was simultaneously engaged with planning the next week's discussion topics and considering how to draw out the quieter members of the group who had seemed particularly moved by today's conversation. The integration of these different aspects of her life, the tactical vigilance and the intellectual engagement, wasn't compartmentalization but synthesis. Each informed the other, creating a whole that was more effective and more fulfilled than either would be in isolation. When Martha arrived home, she performed her standard security sweep, checking the subtle indicators she'd established to reveal any intrusion during her absence, activating her more sophisticated monitoring systems, verifying that all entry points remained secure. Only after confirming her home's integrity did she allow herself to relax into her evening routine. She was midway through preparing dinner when her secure phone provided by Colonel Bennett's team, signaled an incoming message. The text was brief but significant. Package delivered. Monitors active. Blackwood. The message confirmed that additional security measures had been implemented around her property. Discrete surveillance systems that would provide early warning of any approach by Veracity Collective operatives. Martha appreciated the support while recognizing it as a supplement to, rather than replacement for, her own security protocols. As she settled into her evening reading, Martha reflected on how the day's events exemplified the balance she'd established between her former operational life and her current civilian identity. The Veterans Literature Group represented genuine purpose and connection, while the security precautions ensured she could continue that meaningful work without naivete about the threats arrayed against her. This integration hadn't been easily achieved. The early years of retirement had been marked by struggle. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive through decades of operations had initially made civilian life almost unbearably stressful. Every public space had presented overwhelming tactical challenges. Every interaction had triggered threat assessments that exhausted her, even as they protected her. Literature had provided the first bridge between her operational mindset and a sustainable civilian existence. Books offered immersive experiences that engaged her analytical capabilities while directing them toward understanding rather than threat neutralization. The precision she'd once applied exclusively to ballistic calculations found new application in analyzing narrative structures and character motivations. Founding the Veterans Reading Group had completed this integration, allowing her to use her unique perspective to create something healing for others while maintaining the vigilance that had become fundamental to her identity. She didn't have to pretend to be someone else. She simply had to apply her authentic self to different purposes. The following morning brought unexpected developments that tested this carefully constructed balance. Martha was tending her garden, an activity that allowed her to maintain surveillance of her surroundings while engaging in genuinely satisfying work, when a black SUV with government plates pulled up in front of her house. Her hand moved instinctively toward the concealed weapon secured beneath the loose brick in her garden wall, before she recognized the vehicle's occupant as James Blackwood, the government consultant she'd met at Fort Garrison. He approached with the measured pace of someone who understood that surprising people with her background was unwise. "Mrs. Collins," he greeted her, remaining at a respectful distance. "I apologize for the unannounced visit, but developments overnight suggested a direct conversation would be prudent." Martha nodded, straightening from her gardening with fluid grace that belied her age. "Of course. Would you prefer to talk inside or out here?" "Inside would be better for the materials I need to show you," Blackwood replied, gesturing toward a secure tablet he carried. Once they were seated in her living room, Blackwood taking the chair that Martha directed him to, which not coincidentally provided her with optimal positioning relative to exits and defensive positions, he activated the tablet and turned it toward her. "Overnight, our surveillance identified 3 vehicles conducting pattern establishment around your regular locations," he explained, displaying images captured by security cameras. Cross-referencing with intelligence databases confirmed connections to Veracity Collective operations in 3 countries. Martha studied the images with professional detachment, noting vehicle specifications, driver characteristics, and operational patterns that suggested experienced surveillance teams rather than amateur watchers. "They're preparing more thoroughly than their first attempt," she observed. "Multiple observation points, distributed surveillance assets, professional distance maintenance. They learned from their failure at Fort Garrison." Blackwood nodded, impressed by her immediate grasp of the tactical implications. "Exactly. This isn't an impulsive reaction to the failed attempt. It's a methodical preparation for a coordinated operation." He swiped to a new screen showing personnel files of 4 individuals. These operators were identified entering the country 3 days ago. All former military with specialized training in urban operations and close-quarters elimination. Their profile matches teams Veracity has deployed for high-value target removals in 3 countries. Martha absorbed this information without visible reaction, though her mind was already calculating implications and response options. They're escalating to a direct approach rather than the standoff method they attempted at Fort Garrison. "That's our assessment," Blackwood confirmed. "Given this development, we're prepared to implement more comprehensive protective measures. A safe house has been prepared, and a security detail is standing by for immediate deployment." The offer was professionally delivered and undoubtedly well-intentioned. It also represented exactly the kind of response Martha had spent her career avoiding: static defensive positions that inevitably became targets themselves, restricted movement that eliminated operational flexibility, dependency on others for security that transferred control to external parties. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Blackwood, but I'll maintain my current approach with appropriate adjustments for the escalated threat profile," she replied with calm certainty. Blackwood studied her with professional assessment rather than the skepticism such a response might typically generate. "I suspected that would be your answer. May I ask what adjustments you're considering?" Martha appreciated his respect for her autonomy and expertise. Rather than arguing or insisting on standard protective protocols, he was engaging with her as a professional equal capable of making informed security decisions. "Distributed surveillance tripwires beyond the perimeter you've already established. Randomized schedule variations beyond my existing pattern disruption. And preparation of specific response scenarios for most likely approach vectors." Blackwood nodded, recognizing the comprehensiveness of her planning. "Those align with our recommendations. I've been authorized to offer additional resources if they would assist your preparations without compromising your operational preferences." What followed was a detailed technical discussion between two specialists with decades of experience in security operations. Martha drawing on her background as a precision operator who had both implemented and evaded surveillance. Blackwood contributing insights from more recent intelligence on veracity collective methodologies. Their conversation reflected mutual professional respect rather than the patronizing protectiveness that often characterized security discussions with presumed vulnerable targets. Blackwood recognized that Martha's age and civilian status didn't diminish the operational expertise she developed through decades of specialized service. As they concluded their discussion, Blackwood provided one additional piece of information that shifted the tactical landscape significantly. "There's one more element you should be aware of. Intelligence indicates that Viktor Korshunov himself may have entered the country to oversee this operation personally." Martha's expression remained neutral, but her eyes sharpened at this news. Korshunov's direct involvement changed the operational dynamics considerably. His presence suggested this was no longer just about eliminating a former operator who had impacted his family, but a personal vendetta that carried symbolic importance for the Veracity Collective's reputation. "That changes the probable timeline," she noted. "Korshunov won't want to wait indefinitely for perfect conditions. His presence creates pressure for action regardless of preparation status." "Precisely our assessment," Blackwood confirmed. "We estimate they'll move within the next 72 hours, based on observed preparation patterns and Korshunov's typical operational tempo." As Blackwood prepared to leave, he paused at the door with an observation that revealed his deeper understanding of Martha's situation. "The veterans at your reading group yesterday, they have no idea who was really leading their discussion, do they?" Martha smiled slightly. "They know exactly who was leading their discussion. A retired librarian who understands that literature can help process experiences that defy easy categorization. The fact that I gained that understanding through classified operations rather than academic study doesn't change the value of the insights." Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. "You've achieved something remarkable, Mrs. Collins. Most operators who leave service struggle to find purpose that matches the intensity and clarity of operational assignments. You've built something meaningful that honors both who you were and who you've become." "The secret," Martha replied, "is recognizing that they're not different people. The precision, focus, and discipline that made me effective as an operator are the same qualities that make me effective as a discussion facilitator. The context changes, but the core remains consistent." After Blackwood departed, Martha implemented the additional security measures they had discussed, working with methodical efficiency to establish new defensive perimeters and response protocols. The gardening tools were set aside in favor of specialized equipment retrieved from concealed storage locations throughout her property. By mid-afternoon, her home had been transformed into a carefully prepared operational environment. Not a fortress that would attract attention, but a space where every entry point was monitored, every approach vector covered, every potential vulnerability addressed with subtle countermeasures. As evening approached, Martha prepared for her weekly dinner with Eleanor, the head librarian from Fort Garrison. Their friendship had developed naturally from Martha's regular book donations, evolving into a standing Thursday evening meal that both women valued as an opportunity for conversation beyond their professional interactions. Martha considered canceling given the elevated threat assessment but decided against it. Maintaining normal patterns while implementing enhanced security measures would provide better operational outcomes than obvious disruptions that would signal awareness of surveillance. Instead, She implemented the appropriate protocols for secure movement and public exposure, then proceeded with her plans. The restaurant they frequented was a small Italian place near the town center, family-owned and consistently busy enough to provide the background activity that enhanced security while maintaining quality that justified regular visits. Martha arrived early, selecting a table that offered optimal positioning relative to entrances and exits, while appearing to casual observers as nothing more than a convenient seating choice. When Eleanor arrived, their conversation flowed with the easy familiarity of established friendship, touching on community events, library programs, and literary discussions. To anyone observing, they appeared to be exactly what they were: two women who shared professional interests and personal connection, enjoying their regular dinner together. What remained invisible was Martha's continuous situational awareness, her mental tracking of everyone who entered the restaurant, her identification of potential security concerns, her maintenance of response readiness while engaging fully in conversation with Eleanor. "The Veterans Poetry Workshop has been surprisingly popular," Eleanor was saying. "We had to add a second session to accommodate everyone interested in participating. Your recommendation to bring in that visiting poet last month really sparked something." Martha smiled, genuinely pleased by this development. Poetry provides language for experiences that prose sometimes can't capture. There's something about the compression of meaning into carefully chosen words that resonates with people who've experienced intense situations. Their conversation continued through dinner, touching on plans for upcoming library events and the community reading initiative they'd been developing together. Throughout the evening, Martha maintained her dual awareness, fully present in the meaningful conversation while continuously monitoring for security threats. As they left the restaurant, Martha noticed a vehicle parked across the street that matched one identified in Blackwood's surveillance photos. The observation was professional rather than intrusive, maintaining distance, using appropriate cover, establishing pattern recognition rather than preparing immediate action. Martha adapted her departure route accordingly, implementing one of the contingency plans she'd prepared for precisely this scenario. The adjustment appeared to Eleanor as nothing more than a casual suggestion to walk through the park, rather than taking their usual route back to the parking area. "The evening's too beautiful to rush," Martha explained with a smile that gave no indication of her tactical calculations. "Besides, I want to hear more about that historical fiction series you mentioned earlier." Their walk through the park provided Martha with multiple advantages: better visibility of potential approach vectors, increased distance from the surveillance vehicle, and natural barriers that would complicate any attempt at direct intervention. All these security benefits remained invisible to Eleanor, who simply enjoyed the pleasant evening stroll with her friend. When they reached Eleanor's car, Martha maintained her vigilance while exchanging warm goodbyes. "Same time next week?" Eleanor confirmed as she unlocked her door. "Wouldn't miss it," Martha assured her. "I'm bringing that book of Mary Oliver poems I mentioned. I think you'll particularly appreciate her observations on nature and attention." As Eleanor drove away, Martha implemented her security protocols for returning home, varying her route, maintaining awareness of vehicles that might be following, identifying potential intervention points along her path. The practices were so ingrained they required minimal conscious attention, allowing her mind to simultaneously reflect on her evening with Eleanor and plan adjustments to her defensive preparations based on the confirmed surveillance. What struck her most profoundly was how these parallel awareness streams had become integrated, rather than competing. The Martha who enjoyed literary discussions with her friend and the Martha who identified tactical threats were not separate identities but aspects of a unified whole, different applications of the same core qualities that defined who she was. This integration represented her most significant achievement since leaving active service. Rather than compartmentalizing her past and present, she had found ways to honor both simultaneously, creating a life that was authentic rather than fragmented. As she approached her home, Martha acknowledged that the coming days would test this integration in ways she hadn't experienced since retirement. The Veracity Collective's escalating operations would demand full implementation of her operational capabilities, potentially forcing public demonstration of skills she had kept carefully concealed for years. Yet even facing this challenge, Martha felt a calm certainty that transcended mere confidence. Whatever came, she would meet it with the same precision, focus, and clarity that had defined her throughout her life, whether lining up an impossible shot from 4,000 meters or helping veterans find healing through literature. Some skills, once truly mastered, become inseparable from identity itself. Some excellence, once achieved, finds expression regardless of context. And sometimes, the things that make us exceptional in one arena prove equally valuable in entirely different circumstances, if we have the wisdom to recognize their broader application. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.